Track 2. So far as I know, this was the first time a national clothing manufacturer had retained outside counsel on public relations. With headquarters in Chicago, they distributed their clothing through selected retail stores. These benefited from Hart, Schaffner & Marx's extensive national advertising showing handsome, vigorous males. Hart, Schaffner & Marx stood out from run-of-the-mill clothing manufacturers. They had made an epoch-making agreement with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union at a time when sweatshops still dominated the industry. The Hart, Schaffner & Marx annual economic essay contests had associated their name with universities throughout the country, a worthwhile association. Messrs. Hart, Schaffner & Marx were actually people. But by 1925 they had either retired or were on the verge of retirement, and the administration of the company was in the hands of Mark Cresap and Al Levy, with whom I worked. Cresap was a wiry, alert, and perceptive businessman, a go-getting salesman. He lived a 24-hour-a-day existence for the glory of the firm. Levy, an artist businessman, loved the clothing business and was in charge of production. He chose fabrics, decided on their color, and shaped the contours, always aware that the firm's success depended on maintaining style leadership. That was a tough assignment, for a year might elapse between the choosing of weave, weight, and color of the fabrics, the determination of style, and the sale of the suit in the retail store. After manufacture, clothing was shown to retailers before it was shown to the public. As in women's wear, the spring styles were ready in the preceding fall, and next fall's styles were ready in the spring. Cresap and Levy wanted to ensure that the styles they picked and manufactured would appeal to the public a year later in New York, San Francisco, New Orleans, or Minneapolis. Enlisting public support for men's and women's fashions was similar, except that leadership in men's clothing depended on the English, the Prince of Wales, and the peers of the realm, and not on the French. Hart, Schaffner & Marx provided itself with an English style consultant, Captain J.A. Murdoch, a veteran of World War I, socially well-connected, a writer on clothes, and a style advisor to British tailors. His prophecies came true because he made them come true. Captain Murdoch supplied Levy with trend letters. Levy checked on these with personal visits to England. This gave him a firm basis for planning fabric, color, and line. Thousands of workers and the satisfaction of millions of men depended on Murdoch's and Levy's judgment. A lapel too narrow or too broad, too many or too few buttons on a sleeve, the width of a trouser leg, the cut of a vest, high or low, could make or break a year's line. We thought of our problem as affecting leverage points of influence. A photograph of the Duke of Westmoreland wearing a certain kind of plaid influenced the American buyer. What the American style-conscious male heard over the air or read in newspapers or magazines about men's clothes molded his point of view. We issued style bulletins for men, and we distributed these to trade papers, house organs, and male style leaders. We supplied radio stations and motion picture newsreels with features. We set up a style bureau for men, which furnished pictures and actual garments to photographers, artists, and art directors for illustrations for advertisements in which well-dressed men appeared. We wanted consumers to be presented with Hart, Schaffner & Marx fashions. Captain Murdoch sent us a steady supply of photographs of the Duke of York and other British notables wearing suits like those we hoped would become fashionable in the United States. A photograph service for newspapers was started, and captions identified the name of the fabrics used in the Hart, Schaffner & Marx suits, such as Dixie weaves or Glen Urquhart plaids. Hart, Schaffner & Marx women's fashions received comparable treatment. Here we changed the leverage point from London to Paris. That summer I took with me to Europe new fall women's coats and arranged for French models to wear them at the Paris races. I had photographs taken and placed them in leading French and American fashion magazines and newspapers. L'Art et la Mode, Très Parisienne, L'Officiel de la Couture, and Le Mode carried full-page pictures of them. Magazines were mailed from Paris to our dealers in this country to let this visible evidence demonstrate our style leadership. American fashions today don't need psychological support of France. We held periodic fashion shows, the first one in the spring of 1924. These shows were planned to create news. I wrote a monologue for Mr. Levy. 100 newspaper fashion writers, newsreel, and news photographers attended. The male model was photographed with a bobbed hair flapper holding an eggplant the color of the fabric. "Just blame Wales," read our caption. "Eggplant to influence men's garb. The Prince of Wales has given his blessing to these colors in London." Widespread newspaper publicity snowed us under. With the cooperation of Charles Dana Gibson, creator of the Gibson Girl, Nasa McMean, the illustrator, and Nicholas Murray, the photographer, we introduced women's coats in June with similar success. At another show in New York, we displayed 100 years of men's suit fashions. Magazines and newspapers eagerly picked this up as a pictorial feature. Later, we asked businessmen to discuss the part clothes played in their own business success, which created interest. I recommended that Captain Murdoch come to the United States to lecture before menswear retail associations on the style leadership he and Hart, Schaffner, and Marx represented. Soon after his arrival here, we asked to have Mayor Walker receive him at City Hall. Mayor Walker was nattily attired in a typical Broadway-type outfit, tight-waisted and obtrusive. Captain Murdoch complimented Walker on his dress, saying the mayor cut a neat figure. "That's nothing to the figure in the budget," Mayor Walker quipped. Procter & Gamble was my client for over 3 decades, from Harding's administration to the post-World War II years. Procter & Gamble proved to be a microcosm of industry. The company's acceptance of public relations had a great influence on other companies, for Procter & Gamble had a reputation for being well managed, and other companies took their cue from them. Their changing attitude toward public relations in this period reflected industry's changing attitudes. In 1923, Procter & Gamble of Cincinnati, Ohio, was one of America's largest soap and vegetable fat manufacturers. 2 products dominated its business: Ivory Soap and Crisco. The company had adopted a revolutionary merchandising policy of advertising to whoop up consumer buying, thus making the company independent of jobbers. Until then, jobbers had pushed the sales of products on which they made the most profit. Products were at the mercy of jobbers. Instead, Procter & Gamble hired hundreds of salesmen who visited retailers and sold goods directly. Procter & Gamble instituted a further innovation in connection with this move by engaging a council on public relations. They commissioned the president of their advertising agency, the Blackman Company, Jake Frazier, to find one. His selection of me was a feather in my cap. The company paid me $12,000 a year for counsel. But more than that, I was now associated with a great American company. My first activities centered on what is today called brand name promotion, in this case, Ivory Soap and Crisco. Ivory had unique qualities. It was white and floated, and, unlike most soaps, was unperfumed. I capitalized on these characteristics by hiring a hospital consultant, Oliver H. Bartine, to survey U.S. hospital officials on the advantages of a white, unperfumed soap. The official's comment in support of white, unperfumed soap gained nationwide publicity. We did not mention Ivory. This was unnecessary because it was the only white soap on the market. Here was a beneficent monopoly, without anyone having to worry himself about it. That survey made such an impression on the public consciousness that we tried similar ones. At our suggestion, a businessman wrote to other businessmen asking them to express their preference as to colored, scented, or pure white unscented soap. Pure white unscented won by an overwhelming margin, and this information was duly publicized by the press. Next, the magazine Medical Life made a survey among club women asking their preferences as to soap and water or face paint and powder. Soap and water plus the wash rag won out, and there were many news stories about this throughout the country. These activities, we all felt, gave the advertising of Ivory Soap greater penetration because the public had been preconditioned to accept the advertising. I also went in for press agent stunts. An Ivory Soap yacht race in which boys participated on the lake in Central Park gained nationwide attention. And Will A. Page, press agent of the Ziegfeld Follies, called a meeting of the Follies Girls' New Amsterdam chapter of the Dorcas Society, at which the girls unanimously passed a resolution to use nothing but warm water and pure white unscented floating soap on their faces. I decided that there wasn't much difference in getting people to buy tickets for a play or soap at a counter. I initiated a national household service which supplied the public with household hints. I tried to think of new dramatic ways to relate soap to current events. There was always a challenge in whether the company would accept the idea. Ideas are not always judged on merit, but by the frame of reference of the decision-maker. Communities, I thought, might be induced to wash their statues in public buildings because of civic pride, and this might stimulate cleanliness among the citizens. We organized a committee to encourage cleaning of statues. I also hit on the soap sculpture movement, and as a result, millions of school children carved ivory soap for the next quarter century. Brenda Putnam, a sculptor, had written to the company asking for large blocks of ivory soap, which she wanted to use instead of clay for sculpting. That gave me the idea for a nationwide soap sculpture competition for school children to further a laudable social objective, creative and artistic expression in an inexpensive medium. Children, the enemies of soap, would be conditioned to enjoy using ivory, and nothing would be wasted. Soap shavings could be used for washing. The coincidence of public and private interest in the mingling of soap and art was so incongruous that it was bound to be newsworthy. In 1928, I tried out a variation of the soap sculpture idea with another art, photography. Ivory soap was advertising the use of soap to keep hands clean and beautiful. I noted that American advertisers often focused public attention on specific areas of the body to sell their products. Public attention focused on lips helped lipsticks to popularity. Focus on legs stimulated stocking sales. Beautiful hands photographic contests in New York, Philadelphia, and other cities helped create a favorable public climate for the ivory advertisements. To get publicity for a new soap when Procter & Gamble was expanding its line of soaps, I wrote to newspaper editors asking why they shouldn't critically appraise a new soap, just as they criticized music, drama, and literature. A flood of publicity resulted. Working daily in the advertising department was Dr. Paul Smeltzer, a psychologist who studied advertising's impact on the public. Even the width of grocers' shelves was measured to make sure soap or Crisco packages would fit. Procter & Gamble pioneered in meeting their public's tastes. I was asked to advise on major company policies. Procter & Gamble's relations with the public, with the soap industry, with stockholders, with its purveyors, with plant communities, with its employees, all came within our scope. We were consulted on the company's relations with educational groups, women's groups, and the mass media. In 1948, Procter & Gamble asked me to give them a program to meet the company's social responsibilities. My program emphasized company leadership, and that meant leadership in the activities on which it impinged. I suggested company participation in civic and community affairs. I used the segmental approach in company activities. A talk by Procter & Gamble's controller at a controllers' convention raised the company's prestige among controllers. Advertising, research, purchasing, home economics, and other department heads did their stints before groups of interest to them. I compared this public relations approach to the Mississippi River. Its powerful current flows from its tributaries. The most socially constructive activity I performed at this period developed from a radio program contest conducted by Ralph Edwards and sponsored by Procter & Gamble. Participants vied for staggering prizes by completing in 25 words a sentence that began, "I support the name of a voluntary health association because." The winners were awarded trips around the world. It was suggested that contestants include a contribution for the health organization with their entry. We could not make a donation obligatory because the U.S. postal laws prohibited such conditions for entry into a contest. But a casual and perfectly legal suggestion to contribute often brought in over $1 million per contest. The Voluntary Health Association received all the money contributed. Taking account of my 30 years with them, I find that the most significant element was the fine reputation the company maintained, a 99 44/100% pure reputation, despite citations by the Federal Trade Commission for infraction of regulations, antitrust suits, and a lawsuit involving industrial spying. The products of Procter & Gamble were good. Its profit-sharing and guaranteed employment plans were progressive. My assignment as counsel on public relations to the American Tobacco Company, a blue-chip corporation that made cigarettes and cigars, followed close on the heels of our relationship with Procter & Gamble. 3 cigarette companies, Liggett & Myers, R.J. Reynolds, and American Tobacco, had the major share of the cigarette market. For many years, American had spread its advertising allotment over 50 different tobacco products, making no large dent on the public with any one of them. Lucky Strike had been a late entry in the cigarette sweepstakes. Its name had formerly belonged to a chewing tobacco. Albert Lasker, who headed the Lord & Thomas Advertising Agency of Chicago, persuaded Percival Hill, then president of the company, to throw his entire advertising appropriation into promoting Lucky Strike cigarettes. Within 3 years, sales zoomed from 25 million to 150 million cigarettes a day, and Lucky Strike gained first place among cigarettes, a position it held for 2 decades. I worked with American after George Washington Hill had taken over the presidency from his father. He reminded me of a cowboy because he kept his big Stetson sombrero on throughout our conversations. The agency account executives told me this was typical. Hill always kept his hat on. They took theirs off. When I worked with the hat industry, I had made a study of the symbolic significance of hats. I think that Hill may have regarded his sombrero as a crown, and he kept it on because he felt himself a ruler. His identification with rulers was shown in his attitude toward his own personnel. There was a belligerent truculence in his manner, and his staff quivered nervously when he buzzed for them or asked to see them. I found that this attitude also dominated his dealings with stockholders and others with whom he came into business and social contact. I believed then, and still do, in the competition of products and ideas in the marketplace as an integral part of our democratic society. Yet, had I known in 1928 what I know today, I would have refused Hill's offer. In the first place, cancer has been strongly linked with cigarette smoking. Furthermore, I no longer enjoy participating in or watching the kind of lethal competition that fascinated Hill and drove him to so many commercial excesses. With pitiless and ruthless force, he tried to dominate the market and destroy all competition. Hill would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. His energy and drive were concentrated at the time in a single purposeful direction, to sell more Lucky Strikes. He spent hours personally working out demonstrations his salesmen could use to convince retailers that the tobacco in Lucky Strikes was better than that in competitive brands. Actually, most cigarettes were made with practically the same ingredients, but the blindfold test he invented was talked about so often that people believed it. He'll never stop thinking about the huge potential Lucky's market, the women of America. New surveys showed him that women were now smoking in and out of the house. They also disclosed that many women objected to Lucky's because the green package with its red bullseye clashed with the colors of the clothes they wore. Sometime in the spring of 1934, Hill called me. "Women aren't buying Lucky's as they should. What do you suggest, Mr. Bernays?" he asked. "Change the Lucky package to a neutral color that will match anything they wear," I replied. This was a logical suggestion, but Hill became emotional at the idea of changing the color of his package. "I've spent millions of dollars advertising the package. Now you ask me to change it. That's lousy advice." I said, "If you won't change the color of the package, change the color of fashion. To green." "Change the fashion. That's a good idea. Do it," Hill shouted enthusiastically, adding as an afterthought, "What will it cost?" I knew that money alone couldn't change a fashion. Such a change depended on setting forces in motion that would influence other forces, and these in turn might change the fashionable color. I had no idea of the money necessary for mechanics, so I plucked a round figure out of the air. "$25,000. Spend it," yelled Hill. That was the beginning of a fascinating 6-month activity for me, to make green the fashionable color. Fashions seldom happen fortuitously. They follow trends. A planned event of importance can play a part in affecting these trends. The costumes and decor of the Bal de l'Opéra in Paris, held annually by French textile manufacturers, and the Haute Couture of Paris, with the cooperation of the Au Monde, had influenced French fashion trends. So why not a green ball in New York? Why should an American ball planned along comparable lines influence fashion trends here, particularly if it was linked with Paris fashion influences? Some years before, I had asked Alfred Reeves of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association how he had developed a market for American automobiles in England, where roads were narrow and curved. "I didn't try to sell automobiles," he answered. "I campaigned for wider and straighter roads. The sale of American cars followed." This was an application of the general principle which I later termed the engineering of consent. Like an architect, I drew up a comprehensive blueprint, a complete procedural outline, detailing objectives, the necessary research, strategy, themes, and timing of the planned activities. I wanted to be sure the money Hill had authorized was spent effectively. Next, consistent with our usual policy, I researched the impact of green on society. The future always holds within it something of the past and present. I wanted to know the values embraced in the color green. Green had psychological, health, and aesthetic values. Green was the color of spring, an emblem of hope, victory, and plenty. the springtime of life and recuperation. It suggested calm, peace, and serenity. A statistical analysis disclosed that green was featured in 5% to 50% of the current lines of the great French fashion houses. The average is almost 20%, an encouraging base on which to build. I also studied the part played by fashion magazines, socialites, top dress houses and manufacturers, newspapers and women's magazines in influencing the popular colors in the country. Soon we were at work on 2 continents, making contact with a variety of social and economic groups. First I talked to Mrs. Frank A. Vanderlip, a friend, chairman of the Women's Infirmary of New York, wife of the former chairman of the National City Bank. I suggested that a green ball be held in November under the infirmary's auspices for the hospital's benefit. I explained that a nameless sponsor would defray the costs up to $25,000. Our client would donate our services to promote the ball. The color green would be the ball's motif and the obligatory color of all the gowns worn at the ball. I now approached Philip Vogelman, the enterprising president of the Onondaga Silk Company, and suggested his firm become the spearhead for color leadership in the United States. He listened to the program I outlined, and then agreed to bet on green. Vogelman gave a Green Fashions Fall Luncheon that spring for fashion editors and fashion trades at the Waldorf Astoria to induce these industries to follow his lead in picking green and to stimulate public acceptance of the color. Joseph Cummings Chase, a portrait painter and the head of Hunter College's art department, discussed green in the work of great artists. Dr. Joseph Jastrow, the psychologist, discussed the psychological implications of green. I had wondered at the alacrity with which scientists, academicians, and professional men participated in events of this kind. I learned they welcomed the opportunity to discuss their favorite subject and enjoyed the resultant publicity. In an age of communication, their own effectiveness often depended on public visibility. Widespread publicity followed the lunch. The New York Sun headlined its story, "It looks like a green winter." The New York Post stressed a green autumn. One press service reported, "Fall fashions stalking the forests for their color note, picking green as the modish fall wear." Throughout the summer, the Bureau maintained its barrage. We were encouraged to note that green pencils and green writing paper followed the accelerating trend to that color. Without our nudging, other firms got on the green bandwagon. The women's page editor of a Philadelphia newspaper wrote, "Let me know what you are plugging. It is so adroit that even I, hard-boiled old she-dragon, can't detect it. If, as I suspect, it is glazed chintz, I will add a description with place to buy, including prices. I have a lot of respect for the clever copywriter who is responsible for such readable material, and I am quite willing to play along in a helpful way." Our effort to make green the fashion color sold chintz as an unanticipated corollary. Onondaga didn't make chintz, and I never asked them how much green silk they sold. That was of less concern to them than their style leadership. The retail buyer, who purchases his material from the manufacturer long before the consumer does, bets on the public acceptance of a color or weave when he buys. If he believes a manufacturer is right about future consumer demand, he is more likely to patronize him. Thousands now asked to be put on the Onondaga Bulletin mailing list. Department stores, theatrical producers, radio fashion commentators, art editors, pattern companies, and trade papers added to the spreading enthusiasm for green. The praise of green in newspapers rose in a crescendo through the summer. In September, Altman's Fifth Avenue windows were filled with green dresses and suits. Women's magazines were featuring green fashions on their covers. The November issue of Vogue carried 2 pages of sketches of the green dresses to be brought from Paris to New York. We knew now that green had arrived. I don't recall bothering to check Hill's reaction. The color green was so omnipresent that he could not escape it. I was not looking for praise. Only once in a relationship of 8 years did he indicate to me that he was pleased with my work. On that occasion it was Paul Hahn, his assistant, who wrote to me that Hill liked an idea I had submitted to him. I have found over many years that satisfaction is usually inherent in a re-engagement from year to year. The fact is that the professional engaged in a specialized activity is usually the best judge of the effectiveness of his activity. Hill was a freewheeler. I doubt whether a serious business committee today would permit me to retain a psychoanalyst to evaluate billboards, parade women on Fifth Avenue lighting cigarettes as symbolic torches of freedom, or authorize me to plan and organize a green ball. these ideas would be regarded as far out, remote, and risky. Or if by chance they were accepted, they would be so diluted by the time they got into the works that they would be worn thin and possibly ineffective. Today's corporate leadership is essentially conformist. It prefers to play safe and remain in power. But in the present world situation, American business needs dynamic, imaginative, individual leadership. Business needs to recapture some of the spirit of pioneering, adventure, and initiative that Hill exemplified. But it must be tempered by social responsibility, which Hill did not have. 15 years after Kennesaw Landis' decision to break the great Standard Oil Company into separate units, I was called on by one of these units, now independent, the Vacuum Oil Company. It wanted public support for a merger proposed with another one of the split-up units, the Standard Oil Company of New York. Vacuum manufactured vacuum oil. I was plunged into the committee system of management, retained from its Standard Oil Company days. I do not believe 10 minds jointly arrive at a sounder conclusion than they do individually. In this case, one veto held up a decision until the next meeting. Consensus instead of majority rule prevailed. Maybe John D. Sr., in the original company, wanted his final veto on everything, and the practice continued. For hours at these meetings, I listened to interminable discussion to find that one objection tabled a topic until the next meeting. Action was slow. Eben Griffith, a restrained man who showed the wear and tear of the committee system in his bland indecision, presided at our meetings. George Walker, a tall, charming, handsome man with black hair tinged with gray, was his immediate subordinate. His job as aide-de-camp to General John T. Pershing at AEF Staff Headquarters in Europe earned him his post at Vacuum. He was well-dressed, groomed, and mannered. A man, I learned, advances in business through his personal appearance, as a woman does on the stage. Walker was in a class with Warren G. Harding, Paul V. McNutt, and Edward R. Stettinius. We directed our effort to the newspapers of the country, pointing out the rationale for the merger in the public interest. We prepared and sent them public opinion briefs. Editorials appeared favoring the merger of the two companies. The court finally ruled that Vacuum and Standard Oil of New York could combine. The arguments we had used in our public opinion briefs were used in the court decision. This may have been a coincidence, for there were only a limited number of arguments in favor. Or it may not. A climate of opinion helps make court opinions. The law reflects changing times and customs. Vacuum had another problem. Its oil was man-made. Pennsylvania crude oil producers advertised that their oils were found in nature. They were not fabricated, and therefore they were better. This fallacious advertising was accepted by buyers and made inroads on Vacuum's markets. Chemically, there was no difference except that Vacuum oil was purer. I went to Louis Haney, who was financial columnist for the New York American and head of New York University's Bureau of Business Research, and we retained the Bureau to find out from scientists if oils could be made as good as the natural product. Judgments were confirmatory, and the results were publicized widely. Editor and publisher attacked what I had done as propaganda, which it was. True propaganda. We worked on Vacuum's radio commercials and dramatized ideas of interest to consumer groups. The anniversary of Watt's invention of the steam engine became a day of tribute to him by Vacuum, and we broadcast messages from presidents of railroads honoring Watt. Vacuum supplied free oil, technical advice, and publicity to the early pioneering airplane flights. If flying succeeded, Vacuum would benefit from the associations it had established. The use of vacuum fuel in successful flights could be publicized, and Vacuum presumably would gain favor with an increasing number of automobile consumers of oil, who would transfer to their own automobiles the kudos Vacuum had won for itself in the air. I worked with early aviation pioneers, notably Captain Kingsford Smith, who made the first non-stop flight from England to Canada, and with Dr. Hugo Eckner, with his lighter-than-air craft, the Dornier DOX, which he flew from Switzerland to Portugal, then to Brazil, and finally to its Lakehurst hangar in New Jersey and to New York. The night Kingsford Smith was due to land in the United States, I kept in touch with him through the shortwave receiving set at the New York Times office. When I got there, he was reported somewhere over Newfoundland, but the northern magnetic field was too powerful for his instruments to maintain contact with the land for his direction. At first, we heard his loud signals, then only a buzz. For hours he flew round and round without knowing where he was. The operator and I waited nervously, for the noise stopped. This could mean that he had cracked up. But when I left after midnight, he was still flying. In the morning I learned that he had been able to make a landing somewhere in maritime Canada just before his gasoline gave out. Although he failed to reach his original destination, New York, and arrived there by train, his flight confirmed that flights across the Atlantic Ocean east to west were possible, and it accelerated the advance of transatlantic air travel. The DOX flight to this country illustrated contemporary flying hazards. Replacements for defective machinery could be delivered only by conventional means of transportation. When the DOX broke down after its successful flight from Europe to Brazil, the crew had to wait for weeks while replacement parts were brought by a slow boat from Europe. The American public was excited about the DOX because it was built along the lines of the famous Graf Zeppelin. After many weeks of delay, the DOX arrived at Lakehurst, and I arranged a flight over New York for newspaper people. At the insistence of the company attorneys, all guests signed a document releasing Vacuum and the flight entrepreneurs from responsibility. International trade was not of national concern in 1926, as it is today. Few American firms had foreign subsidiaries. But Vacuum Oil had subsidiaries in many parts of the world, usually separate companies incorporated in the foreign country, with Americans and foreign nationals on their boards. VIPs from foreign countries in which Vacuum had a subsidiary occasionally came to the United States. Vacuum asked me to organize an itinerary for Claude McKay, publisher of an influential Australian newspaper. He was accompanied by Beryl Mills, winner of a Miss Australia beauty contest conducted by his paper. We organized a committee of welcome to distinguished Australians visiting the United States. We went through the VIP New York routine, a visit to the mayor, luncheon with Adolph Oakes at the New York Times, and then Niagara Falls and Washington. Then Miss Mills wanted to enter the Atlantic City bathing beauty contest. I advised against it to preserve Miss Mills as a symbol of middle-class, reserved Australian girlhood. Fortunately, Miss Mills was agreeable, and the company's reputation remained untarnished. The Standard Oil Company's response to public opinion had changed from the days before John D. Sr. started giving away dimes and then millions. I would have questioned anybody's judgment if they had told me in 1929 that William S. Paley, the young 27-year-old man who asked for my public relations counsel for a plaything his father had bought him, would in 30 years be head of a huge economic empire, the Columbia Broadcasting Company. Paley looked even younger than he was. He was affable, cool, suave, polite, soft-spoken, and well-groomed. He told me he was graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a B.S. degree in economics, and had become vice president and secretary of the Congress Cigar Company, which manufactured Polina cigars, named after the family, in Philadelphia. Radio broadcasting had a powerful fascination for a young man with ambition in 1928. Miraculously, sound came out of a box. Without wires, it seemed miraculous. Radio no longer is an epoch-making new concept, but then, radio was astounding, a scientific wonder. It made a more profound impression on me than the first motion pictures. I had had preparation for them, for as a boy at home I played with a primitive motion picture machine made up of pictures in a revolving cylinder. But nothing like it preceded radio. Growth corporations are the hopes of the speculative American investor today. He buys the stock of these companies, hoping they will grow faster than the economy. But the most imaginative seeker after growth would have hesitated prophesying the spectacular strides of Columbia Broadcasting from 1929 to today. I immediately plunged into the one-man show, of which Paley was ship and captain and crew. He worked diligently. His hours were long, a change from his previous Playboy days. He apparently wanted to succeed, and drove himself. No family ties competed with what he did, for he was unmarried. In a highly competitive situation, this helped. We made a list of recommendations for Paley to help salesmen sell their prospects. Creative ideas for the prospective client were to be prepared, and the salesman taught how to present them. We urged CBS to create a department to coordinate the many activities of the growing company. Paley headed his own public relations department, although a young man was its titular head. We urged Paley to improve the publicity department. We established consistency in headlines. We worked to improve releases. The release about Tosha Seidel, the violinist and our pupil, was a column long. We cut it to 1 inch and urged that this principle of brevity apply to all stories. We found that Columbia's Washington Bureau had sent out an advance and a post story in the same envelope. The radio editor would be more likely to use an advance story if he did not get a post story of the event with it. The treatment of news on radio was in flux. Paley once questioned whether Columbia's broadcast about a prison fire might not bring CBS unfavorable newspaper reaction, because Columbia had presented news of the fire before the newspapers. This seems incongruous today, but Paley feared that Columbia's news policies might be too aggressive. "We are competing with NBC," I told him. "We must take the lead, not draw back. I believe the broadcasting of news is sound. A public appetite has already been created for it. If Columbia and NBC withdraw from this field, the public's appetite will be satisfied by someone, and I believe newspapers will discover news broadcasting helps them instead of hurts them." Research later proved this true, and Columbia did adopt an aggressive news-gathering policy. I kept feeding ideas to Paley. As a goodwill gesture, a social service organization should be allowed to make an appeal over the Columbia system. Columbia should hire an outstanding woman commentator. Columbia should engage an architect like Raymond Hood, who would confer with contractors and builders on the installation of radio reception facilities on roofs. I urged that a prospective artist signed up by Columbia be evaluated beforehand by standards set by public relations and publicity. Columbia would save money and effort by such a procedure, and I recommended an artist's bureau head be appointed who knew both artistic and box office values. I recommended a correction service for newspapers, the absence of which had plagued Columbia for some time. Newspapers were printing incorrect listings because of lack of liaison between the sales, program, and publicity departments. The service was established. In April 1930, Paley worked with me in trying to get President Masaryk of Czechoslovakia and the American minister in Prague to broadcast to the United States. Despite repeated effort, insurmountable technical difficulties prevented transmission between Prague and London. We also tried to get the Pope to broadcast from Rome. My records indicate that Michael Williams, editor of the Commonweal, was most helpful. He sent me a copy of a letter he had sent to Columbia, which had negotiated with the Vatican for 2 years in regard to a papal broadcast. In spite of the fact that arrangements cannot be made on the mechanical side for Easter, I strongly advise you to let no time go by in beginning negotiations for a later date. The Pope finally broadcast from Rome. We aided in another epoch-making event to upgrade radio, Columbia's signing up of the New York Philharmonic Society, which was to build a middle-class and upper-stratum audience for radio, much needed at the time. Theodore Dreiser and Frank Norris, in their most imaginative depictions of power struggles, did not match the realities of the struggle that occurred when two strong financial groups recognized the profit potentials of the new aviation industry and went to war with each other in a short and decisive struggle for millions. In this struggle, more was at stake than in smaller conflicts. The weaponry was more intensive and better organized, and more money was spent. Also, those who acted on my recommendations understood better the value of strategy. Battles are not won by blind slugging. Given equal resources, the side with the best strategy wins. But in the struggle for control of the Aviation Corporation of America, the end was a complete surprise to me and the public. In this proxy war, both sides had unlimited resources to buy the necessary mind power, manpower, and mechanics. The stakes were high. Launched only 3 years before, American Aviation was a holding corporation owning the most extensive air transportation system in the U.S. American Airways was its operating company. The fighting started and ended in November 1932. It was fought along lines more reminiscent of the 20s than the 30s. The New Deal, with its new regulations of the financial community, was still 3 months away. The adversaries were the American Aviation Corporation and Everett Loban Cord, a spectacular promoter, speculator, automobile, airplane, and airplane engine manufacturer. American Aviation had been launched by Lehman Brothers and W.A. Harriman and Company and Associates, who brought out an issue of 2 million shares of common stock at $20 in 1929. The stock, like others, had been hard hit by the crash and the subsequent depression, which had brought about a decline of 83% in all stocks by November 1932. but American aviation stock was still selling above the ratio of the average of other stocks, and above that of most other aviation stocks. Its position of current assets to current liabilities was good, a ratio of 20 to 1, with cash over $9,500,000 and current liabilities only $500,000. Roland Palmado, an associate of Lehman Brothers, told me the company put most store for the future on its operating subsidiary, American Airways, already serving 62% of the largest cities from Canada to Mexico and from the east to the west coast. Since its formation, the company had worked to bring about a coordinated nationwide system of air transportation. Daily scheduled flights covered more than 29,000 miles. Monthly operations, nearly 1 million. They served 69% of the country's population and connected by air and rail with every major U.S. city. In addition to Robert Lehman and W. Averill Harriman, the board had on it David K.E. Bruce, son-in-law of Andrew Mellon, General John F. Orion, who had commanded the 27th Division in World War I, and others of equal high standing. The directors and management were impeccable, representing leaders in aviation, transportation, and finance. The personnel of the company was equally well known. Eddie Rickenbacker, America's flying ace in World War I, was president of American Airways and assistant to Lamont Cohue, president of American Aviation. C.R. Smith was operations manager of American Airways. His experience dated back to the beginning of the business in the South. The aviation company had adjusted to the Depression by decreasing its payroll from September 1931 to September 1934 from $16,000 per month to $7,500 per month. It had increased its revenue $38,000 and its passengers from 7,000 to 10,000, and the payroll costs of American Airways and the Aviation Corporation had been reduced from 30 cents per revenue mile flown to 20 cents per mile, and from 5 cents per seat mile to 3 cents per mile. American Airways was now the lowest-cost large transport system in the United States. American Aviation bought its supplies and equipment with complete freedom, exercising its judgment as to efficiency and price. It maintained a fleet of 5 types of planes and 3 types of engines. The company already owned 130 single and trimotor planes and flew 60 trimotor planes, the largest fleet of its kind in the world. In 3 years' time, it had built up 39 different routes, from Amarillo-Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, Galveston, to the Washington-Cincinnati-Louisville circuit. The aviation company had good labor relations. American Airways pilots, through the Air Pilots Association, had recently given the company its vote of confidence by supporting it in a public statement. Its relations with its 1,100 employees, pilots, mechanics, station managers, radio operators, porters, dispatchers, and others were of the best. The financial policies of the company had not gone as well as other company activities. The directors, with approval of the stockholders, had invested their surplus cash in securities after the crash in October 1929 at prices which then seemed low. As time went on and prices became still lower, investments were increased. The deflation of the last 3 years had reduced the market prices of these securities to the point where it was felt wise to set up a reserve of about $5,200,000 and thus anticipate the loss that would occur if it became necessary to liquidate the securities prior to their anticipated return to higher values. Some of these securities, with a doubtful future, had been sold, realizing a cash loss of about $3,600,000. Management had told the stockholders that the actual losses were proportionately not so far out of line with those of most corporations and individuals, and that the intangible values written off had been replaced by the very sound values of American Airways. And now Cord wanted to take over American Aviation, lock, stock, and barrel. This book is continued on the next cassette.